Consort contended. Just before the address, Catherine came in and paused next to the vacant area. She sensed that courtiers in the vicinity were watching her expression to see whether humiliation would turn into an outright confrontation. William approached, but she discreetly informed him that she would stand so as not to ruin the reception. The sacrifice made sense to the prince. While being openly informed that her future position may still be contested, she was defending his father's event. From across the room, Anne saw the whole conversation. She went up to Camilla after the guests had moved into a different room and inquired as to why Charles had given a clear directive that had been revoked. It was not refuted by the queen consort. In response, she said that she would not consent to being phased out while she was still upright. Anne's self-control stiffened. She cautioned that humiliating Catherine revealed division in front of key Commonwealth members and undermined William as well. Camilla wouldn't put the chair back. She refused to apologize while the incident went on, and that decision became irreversible. Later that evening, Charles got 2 written reports. He read both, put them in his red dispatch box, and remained silent. The box serves as a safe container for the sovereign's most crucial official documents. Anne was persuaded by his delay that personal reluctance had turned into a threat to the institution. The next morning, Anne started working on the continuity order. However, Camilla quickly discovered that a paper was being written against her authority via a taped chat with a senior assistant. She didn't wait for the king to receive it. After the visitors left, the chair was placed back, but the insult persisted, and Camilla would soon meet Anne in a room where neither lady planned to back down. There were no secretaries, no assistants,
but to prove
and no
that the crown could survive
only
when mercy
2 women
remained
stood
stronger
in the king's
than
secret
ambition.
library,
Thanks for
divided
watching.
by a desk and
Please
years of
don't
suppressed
forget to
mistrust.
like and
When
subscribe,
Camilla finally
and we will
faced
see you
Anne,
in-
Camilla requested that the order be destroyed and wouldn't even take a seat. What transpired was hardly a courteous argument between high-ranking royals, who possessed the authority to determine the destiny of the monarchy, was directly at issue. After discovering that Anne was discussing the transfer of ceremonial power to Catherine with high-ranking household officials, Camilla had asked for the meeting. Although she anticipated opposition, she continued to have faith that Charles would prevent his sister from carrying out the plan. Convinced that her marriage provided her with one last defense, the queen consort entered. Arriving with the unsigned continuity order in a simple folder, Anne casually set it on the desk. After opening the paper, Anne described its functions. An internal royal decree known as the continuity order was created to disperse significant responsibilities without affecting anyone's formal title or position in the succession. Neither Camilla's marriage nor her public position would be erased. Would prevent William and Catherine's
Charles
plans to
finally
bring the next
allowed
reign
duty
from
to
being
speak
hampered by
where
personal
affection had once
competition.
created
Camilla put
hesitation.
both hands on the
And
desk.
when the
She
succession
said that
room
Anne
door
had turned
closed
years of
that
personal
evening,
conflict
it
into
did
a
not
public
shut
removal
Camilla
by
out of the
using
monarchy.
Catherine as a weapon.
It
Her voice
confirmed
broke
that
as she
Catherine was
described
ready
how
to
she had
help
been told
carry
she didn't
things
belong
would
for
have
decades,
deepened the
only
wound.
to be ignored
And
when she
Camilla's
eventually made
final
it to the center.
acceptance
The wound was not
transformed
concealed
personal
by the queen
into
consort.
something closer
She
to
desired for
dignity.
Anne to witness it.
Catherine
For a brief
completed her
period,
first
Anne's
briefing in
countenance
session
softened.
room.
In response, she said that suffering could not be used as justification to hinder William or degrade his spouse. Although the princess acknowledged that the choice was unpleasant to her personally, the crown would suffer if the fight continued. She had seen how far the competition had already progressed when one chair was moved. One chair was moved, then Camilla disclosed the pledge she thought would keep her alive. Charles had promised her in a recorded private discussion that as long as he was king, she would never be reduced to a ceremonial shadow. She cautioned that enforcing the injunction may cause him severe distress and harm the marriage Anne said she was attempting to preserve. Anne did not retreat. She opened the folder to the last page after sliding it over the desk. A number of top household officers had previously added written endorsements, indicating that the move was approved by those in charge of the monarchy's day-to-day operations. The only thing lacking was Charles's signature. Camilla saw that her power inside the palace had already crumbled as she gazed at the names. Before either lady could say another word, the entrance to the library opened. As Charles entered, he saw the hierarchy between them and halted. Anne saw the transformation in her brother's face. Camilla turned to face her husband and bided her time. Charles had put off deciding between the monarchy and his marriage for weeks. However, delay itself turned into a choice when Anne and Camilla were in front of him. Neither the sister's desire for change nor the woman's need for control had the most influence in the room. It belonged to Charles, who stood between them, aware that a single signature might tear the brittle thread of his marriage while maintaining the course of the kingdom. Beside Camilla, he had endured years of public condemnation. He now had to make a more severe decision in private about whether or not defending her position had started to jeopardize all all he had vowed to defend. After reading the paper, Charles saw why Anne couldn't complete it by herself. Only the monarch had the power to activate the continuity order, since it reallocated tasks carried out in the sovereign's name. He had the last say, even though his sister could present the case, get the support, and expose the truth. When he requested to be left alone, Anne exited the library. Charles took off his spectacles, leaned his forehead on one palm, and carefully read each phrase. Damage was there on every route. Camilla would be hurt and their marriage would be rocked by signing. The palace would be caught between his orders and her power if they refused. William was summoned to a different consultation. The prince was not asked to urge that anybody be removed while the king had the file. He was asked whether Catherine could take on the new duties right now without making it a public triumph. Before he could soften the question, Catherine responded. She warned William that if her assent ruined his father's marriage, she would decline. There was dread in her voice, not victory. The future king retorted that when responsibility turned into competitiveness, the harm had already started. Refusing now would not make the wound go away. It would only conceal it. Charles felt the choice tighten on him as he turned to the private appendix. An appendix is a supplementary part that provides evidence to support the main text. 3 further instances of Camilla rerouting official briefings, altering precedence orders, or excluding Catherine from preparations that he personally authorized were documented. The official order that determined where senior royals stood, sat, or appeared during official tasks was known as precedence. Every shift had presented more difficulties than Catherine. It had questioned the king's power. The last entry was the most powerful, because they were unsure whether the queen consort's preferences or Charles's written orders would take precedence. Palace servants had begun postponing decisions. Jealousy and marriage were no longer the main points of contention. The monarchy's day-to-day operations were being frozen. Charles grabbed the pen. After a moment of hesitation, he signed his name under the last sentence. Anne came back and took a position across from the queen, who put down the pen without saying anything. He requested that he personally tell Camilla, even though it had taken away her authority. He wanted one more opportunity to clarify that the decision had not destroyed their life together. Anne turned to face the closed door. The queen consort was already outside, near enough to hear every word, but neither of them knew it. Before anybody could be ready for Camilla's response, the ink was still wet when she heard her husband announce that the order had gone into force.
Every new briefing given to the younger woman looked like another piece of authority moving beyond her reach,
keys,
while Charles still wore the crown.
Schedules, and closed
a documented
doors.
palace
The new reality
account later
came to Camilla almost immediately. The folks in her immediate vicinity were still kind, but their directives had altered. Once in charge of briefings, her name vanished. The queen consort realized for the first time that the order was not a warning when Catherine's emerged in its place. Her life had already begun. Before the whole family was notified, the signed directive was given to household departments. Catherine was included right away in meetings for Commonwealth representation, planning sessions for the throne chamber, and top ceremonial briefings. Royal appearances, responsibilities, and public priorities were determined during these private meetings. Her transition from preparation to active authority alongside William made the shift significant. Camilla maintained her title and personal home, but she stayed out of choices related to the upcoming reign. However, the force underneath them had shifted. Rather than being presumed due to her location next to Charles, her future appearances would be authorized one at a time. She was still able to stand next to the king.
Account later
However,
revealed
no
that
longer
William
able to
had requested
influence the
Catherine's
events
inclusion
leading up to
months
William and
earlier.
Catherine's reign. Quiet
Each
request was
proposal
brought
had
into her
been
room by a
delayed
secretary.
after
The ceremonial
objections
council's
emerged from
crimson
within the
briefing
king's
case needed
private
to be sent
household.
back. Camilla
The
held
personal
it for a
team
few moments,
responsible
feeling the
for
weight of all
supporting
the
the
decisions,
monarch's daily
meetings, and
duties and
instructions it had
decisions.
previously stood for.
Those
Then,
delays
without giving him a
convinced the
glance,
future
she let it
king
go. First
that
to go was the
hesitation
case.
was no
She seemed
longer
to have
caution.
authority. After
It had
the door
become
shut,
resistant.
Charles came
Anyone
in and
beyond
requested
that
a
room
private
still had to
conversation.
listen.
Camilla remained
Catherine
silent.
opened the
Before
folder
signing,
and
she
found
questioned whether he had read every page. She took off her wedding ring and set it on the table between them when the king replied in the affirmative. He stared at the emblem of a marriage now damaged by obligation as the queen consort entered the next room without saying anything further. When Catherine opened her first briefing, she saw Anne's handwritten letter. Don't copy anybody. Get ready for the next step. The goal was made evident in the statement. She was not being asked to imitate Camilla. She was being trained to lead in a new way, with influence based on service rather than authority. The 72-hour review period was then explained to William. Charles had 3 days under this section to suspend the decree before it became final. When Camilla saw the identical information in a duplicate that was given to her home, she realized that there was only one more way. She didn't make a formal appeal. The king was not called by her. Rather, Camilla wrote Catherine a single telegram requesting a private meeting without the presence of spouses, advisors, or witnesses. Even if the palace's machinery had already turned against her, Camilla thought that an open discussion with Catherine may still alter the course of events. For years, Catherine and Camilla had communicated via formalities,
raised a
balcony
handwritten
grins,
sign
tactful
reading,
greets, and
"Let
well-planned
Catherine lead
appearances.
with mercy."
All of it was peeled
By
away in
evening,
their private
that
sessions.
single message
There was no
appeared
monarch
across
between them.
broadcasts
The discussion
as the
was not
clearest
led by
symbol
any
of
future
public
king.
feeling.
There were two ladies
The country
who, at
wanted
separate times in
change,
their lives,
but it
had been
also
captivated
wanted
by the
restraint.
same institution.
Anne acted
Camilla
before the
desired that
palace
Catherine
could turn
disobey
pride
the
off
direction.
screen
Catherine was
and turn to
curious as
William
to why
with
taking
anger
on
and
responsibility
pain.
had been viewed
The
as a
future
betrayal.
queen said the
Just
public
as
had
asked,
transformed
Catherine went into the
Charles's
little
act
morning
of
chamber
protection
by herself.
into a
After
story of
dismissing the
female
employees,
revenge.
Camilla placed the
William
signed
reminded
order
her
between
that the
two seats on a
declaration
low
was his
table.
father's
Mattered
choice,
how far away
but he
the
could
main
see
royal
that public
rooms were.
praise
It could
felt
not be
like
interrupted
punishment
by any help.
when it
No
depended on
official
another
could
woman's
subsequently change what
humiliation.
had been spoken.
Camilla
For
heard
no
the
spouse could
her
soften
voice
the
remained
remarks.
steady,
Camilla
but
glanced
the
at the
warning
file
cut
but
through
chose
the
not to
silence.
open it. Charles
You do
may
not
halt the
yet
order
know
before
what
it
he
became
has given
final,
you,
since the
or what it will
72-hour review
cost.
period was still in
But
effect.
before the palace
Catherine
could
couldn't legally
understand the
cancel it on her
decree,
own. However, the
people
monarch would
named
have an
and
excuse
cited
to reinstate
had to
his wife's
confront
previous
what they stood
power
to
if she
gain,
refused.
lose,
The queen consort
and never
knew that this was her
recover.
last
Behind
opportunity.
the titles
Camilla
were
said
three
that she
people
felt as if her own
carrying
position
very
had been
different
obliterated
wounds.
as. She saw
Charles
Catherine
saw
approach
the
the
decree
throne
as
chamber.
protection.
Through the private talk,
Camilla
she disclosed that the chair
experienced
incident
it
and all
as
attempts to
betrayal.
impede the younger woman's
Catherine
ascent
received
had
it as
been
a burden
motivated
she
by
had
fear
never
rather than
demanded.
etiquette.
Yet
The queen
the
had battled for
document
years to
connected
be
them
accepted,
crackling
and now
with
every
unspoken
indication of
conflict.
Catherine's destiny
Charlotte
seemed to
remained
indicate
frozen
that her
at Wright's
own
side.
significance was diminishing.
Palace seemed
Without
ready to move
interjecting,
her aside
Catherine listened. She
before
went
his
on to
reign
describe
had
the
even
effects
ended.
of the Commonwealth
Catherine
welcome.
accepted that
Knowing
the
that quiet
headlines
was the
would
only
be
way to preserve the
brutal, she
ceremonial, she had
reminded
stood
Camilla
next to
that
the missing
she,
chair
too,
as
had
courtiers
spent
observed.
years being
The experience had
compared,
been kept
judged,
by
and
that
presented
quiet, but her
as
feelings
though
had been
every appearance
purposefully
were a
muted.
contest
She had
she
never
entered
desired
willingly.
Camilla's
Received access to
humiliation.
succession
All she had wanted
briefings,
was for duty to
arguing
cease
that
being
the
seen as
change would
treachery.
publicly
At
diminish
last,
her
Camilla
position
urged her to
beside
decline the
Charles.
moved position.
A documented
Catherine
account
hesitated.
from a senior
After giving
palace
George,
secretary
Charlotte, and Louis
later
some
recorded that her
consideration,
voice
she said that she
tightened
could
when
not
she
encourage
mentioned
her
the
kids
king,
to shirk responsibility
revealing how
when it hurt
deeply
to
she
accept
feared
it.
being left
Although the princess
behind
would not
while he
rejoice at
still
the
wore
choice,
the crown.
she would also not flee
William
from it.
did not
One
retreat.
act of compassion
He placed
was
one
provided
hand
by
on the
Catherine.
royal
He
seal
pledged to
fixed to
encourage
the
Charles
chamber
to
door
shield Camilla's
and told her
philanthropic
that
endeavors
Charles had
and stop
already
the palace from
authorized
portraying the
Catherine's
change as
attendance.
punishment.
The
That
king's
was clear to the
approval meant
queen
the meeting
consort.
could
Not
proceed
all of her
without
dignity
further
had been
consent
lost,
from the
but she had
queen
lost
consort's
control.
office.
Camilla stated she wouldn't ask for the review and closed the purchase. Neither lady called the moment of triumph as Catherine stood up. Camilla rendered Catherine's assent irrevocable by declining to participate in the decisive conflict. And more effectively than any proclamation from the palace, the picture that Britain awakened to the next morning summed up the transformation. Careful wording on continuity, shared service, and future planning was included in the royal statement. Most of it was disregarded by the public. Britain only saw one picture. While Camilla's automobile left via a different gate, Catherine left the throne chamber next to Anne. One era seemed to end and a new one to begin in the picture. Crowds gathered, newspapers featured it on their front pages, and the monarchy's internal conflict turned into a global verdict. Before the first transmission started, Catherine read the official bulletin next to William. It was announced that she would take over senior ceremonial coordination and accompany him to certain state and Commonwealth events on behalf of the monarch. Senior ceremonial coordination included shaping the most significant public tasks and formal appearances of the monarchy. The rapid move made it hard to conceal the facts, although Camilla's diminished position was characterized as an opportunity to concentrate on personal causes. Every statement that sounded shameful was avoided by palace authorities. Commentators didn't. They characterized Catherine as the lady now bearing the greatest burden, Anne as the change's architect, and Charles as the hesitant authority.
Yet the king's decision was not a victory
From the
without
outside,
pain.
her assent
He had
seemed to
been
be a
forced to
success.
choose
However,
between
each new
protecting Camilla's
responsibility
sense of
linked her future
security
to the public
and
loss of
preparing the
another lady.
monarchy
William
for a
and Catherine
future that could
silently
no
watched the
longer
first
remain
television
politely
news.
hidden.
The lady, now standing
Charles
at the
signed
doorway
the
of the
order
next
during
ring,
a private
grabbed for the
morning
remote
meeting,
control and switched
then
off
kept
the TV
one
as the
hand
announcer
resting
called.
over the page,
Camilla must be in
as
pain,
though he
the
could
princess
still delay
informed
what the
him. In
ink had made
response, he
final.
said that although
As
compassion
the
was
reigning
important,
monarch,
it was as
he held
important
the
to accept
authority
what
to
could no
approve
longer be
access
changed.
to
At
succession
private
planning.
home, Camilla saw the same picture. She held the newspaper for a long time before delicately folding it instead of destroying it. The headline on the main page said, "Anne closes the old court. Catherine enters the future." She had spent the first several hours driven by anger. Sadness was replacing it now. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered with handmade notes and flowers for Catherine. As people cheered William and his wife on, as they arrived for their first briefing under the new arrangement, one young mother carried her daughter over the barrier. The public scene seemed more like an endorsement of the future than mere curiosity, since Buckingham Palace is the monarch's primary official headquarters. That day, Anne declined to make a public appearance. Camilla sent her a brief note when she sat by herself with the initial order. "You prevailed. Ensure that the organization does." Any sense of victory was erased by the words. Although Anne had succeeded in bringing about the transformation she felt was required, the family was nonetheless damaged.
Anne accepted
After that,
because
Charles
discipline
called
had
one
always
last
mattered
private
more
meeting
to her
with
than and applause.
Catherine, William,
She
and
was
Camilla.
known for
The order was
emotional restraint and loyalty to the institution,
determining whether the long-term effects would also cause them to become permanently divided. Winners and losers have already been announced by the world. However, the individuals at the core of the tempest within the palace still had to determine if their family's continued brokenness was necessary for the crown
to personal alliances.
Camilla's power was not restored,
trusted that
Catherine's
she would not
elevation was not revoked,
privately
and the
before
suffering
touching
caused
the
by
document.
Anne's choice was not
She asked
alleviated
whether
by the last
accepting
meeting.
such power
It accomplished
made her
something more
complicit in
challenging.
Camilla's
Everyone was
downfall.
compelled to face reality
The princess
without any
answered with
ceremonial
quiet
shield.
force.
Camilla's time
Catherine
at the top
had
of the
not
royal
created the
hierarchy
breach
was
of
finished.
trust.
Formally,
She had
Catherine had
simply
started
become the
preparing for
person
the future,
capable
and
of
had shown that
repairing the
allegiance to the
damage.
monarchy
Anne
sometimes
reminded
required
her
taking
that she would
actions
not
against those
bend under
closest to
pressure
her,
from
and Charles
courtiers,
could no longer
family
avoid
members,
making difficult
or the
decisions.
household Camilla
Inside
had
the same
built around
private
herself.
library where the altercation had started,
Charlotte
Charles
flinched.
convened the four
A
royals.
full-body
The
reaction,
72-hour review time had
instinctive and
passed,
immediate.
but the signed
She
continuity
pressed
order was
against
still
Wright's
on the
leg,
desk. The
making
king had
herself
3 days
smaller,
to halt the
her
transfer
breathing
during that
rapid and
review
shallow.
period. The ruling
That
was
flinch
final,
told
and
Wright
Catherine's new
everything.
power could not be
Children who'd
overturned by a
simply been
private
scolded
appeal.
didn't
Charles
react
was the
that
first
way.
to speak.
Children
He
who'd
affirmed
been
that Camilla will
frightened
maintain her
repeatedly,
status as his wife,
systematically.
her personal
Did the
dignity,
radio
and her
crackle
charity
again?
patronages.
Right.
Official
This is
royal link
Captain
to an
Wells.
institution is
What's
known
your
as a charitable
situation?
patronage,
Before
and it
Wright
is
could
often used to
respond,
raise awareness
Camilla
of and
reached for
support for the
Charlotte's
group's
arm.
activities.
Not
However, the monarch also
not
made
with the
one thing very
grandmotherly
clear.
warmth
There would
she
be no
projected in
weakening,
public.
reversal,
Her
or
fingers
interim
closed
treatment
around
of Catherine's
herself.
transferred responsibilities.
The Princess Royal
Camilla turned to
understood the
face
caution
Catherine
planning,
and acknowledged that
the
the choice had
confidential
caused her much
preparation
pain.
for how
She wouldn't
royal
act
duties,
differently. The Queen Consort
emergencies,
said that she
and
had been
leadership
motivated
would
by
pass
fear
into
to
the
defend
next
land
reign.
that she would never be
William
able to
carried
keep.
growing
Catherine praised her
influence
for being open
because
and
he was the
honest,
direct
but she didn't
heir,
act as if one
but only
talk
the
had made
king
up for
could
the
give the
hurt,
decision official
embarrassment, or
force.
animosity between
Charles
them.
looked
Then
at his
Charles turned
son
to face Anne.
and asked
He
whether
expressed
there was
regret for
truly
letting
no
doubt fester
gentler
until his
way.
sister was compelled
The
to take
question
action.
carried more
The king
than
acknowledged
concern
that
for
no one had
further,
been shielded by
intimate,
silence.
threatening.
It had simply made it
Sergeant,
possible for
I'm going to
competition
offer
to
you
grow
some
inside
friendly
the family.
counsel.
Then he
You're new
grabbed
to
Camilla's
palace
hand.
service.
She hesitated
You
for a
don't
long time
comprehend
before
how
taking
things
her
function
wedding
here
ring out of
yet.
her pocket,
Some
putting it back on her
situations
finger,
require
and agreeing to the
discretion.
marriage,
You're creating
even
a
as she gave up
problem
the
where none
authority she had
exists.
lost.
Think
In a
very
secret
carefully
recording of
about
the
your next
encounter,
move.
Anne eventually
New to
broke her
palace
silence.
service.
She
Ceremonial
acknowledged
favor.
that she had never
It was
intended to be the
preparation
one
for
to
a
bring
moment the
Camilla's
crown
era to
could
an
never
end. She took
schedule.
action since
Camilla
everyone else had been
argued that the
waiting for
decision
time to
would look
resolve
like
a
an
problem
early
that was
transfer
becoming
of authority.
increasingly hazardous.
She
There was
insisted
no
the monarchy
celebration of her
needed
win.
one
It
clear
carried
center of
accountability.
power,
With Camilla
while
at her
Charles
side,
remained
Catherine
king.
returned to the royal
Because
chamber.
divided
The Queen
loyalties could
Consort
weaken the
paused at
household
threshold.
and
She
make
turned away
every
without
public
complaint,
appearance
letting
feel
the
like a
younger lady
contest
proceed on her
between the
own.
present
It
and
wasn't
the
just
future.
another public
Yet
setback.
beneath
With
her
all the
careful
dignity she had
reasoning,
left, she made a
William
conscious
heard the
surrender.
same.
One lady had been
But his
dismissed,
silence
and another
only
had been
sharpened her
promoted by
anger.
Anne's single
William
action.
answered before
Camilla
his father
maintained her
could.
dignity
The
despite
prince said the
losing
state opening
institutional
could not be
control.
arranged
Charles
around
opted for
protecting
accountability
personal
rather
pride.
than evasion.
Parliament needed to
Catherine
seek
did not abuse her
continuity
position
beside
of
the sovereign.
authority, the choice that
Catherine
none of
had
them
already
wanted
been
to make
asked to
came at
carry a
Anne's
wider
expense. The meeting was
constitutional
complete
role.
when the doors
That
of the
role
throne
means
chamber
public
closed
duty
behind
supporting
Catherine.
the crown
Camilla's time
and
was over.
preparing for the
The
next
subsequent
reign.
reign
He
had taken the
insisted
lead,
she could no
and since
longer
its
be
future was
treated
at
as
last permitted
decorative
to start,
when
the
the
monarchy
institution
endured. I
increasingly
appreciate you
depended on her
watching.
steadiness.
Please remember to
Catherine
subscribe
remained
and like,
quiet
and we'll see
until
you in the
Camilla
next.
accused
The
the
order
Wales
was not being
household of pushing
reconsidered
for
by
the
the king.
change. The
He was
princess
determining
lifted
whether the
her
long-term
eyes and
effects
said
would
she
also
had
cause them to
neither
become permanently
requested the seat
divided.
nor intended
Winners
to
and
use it
losers have
against
already been
anyone.
announced by the
The
world.
Queen Consort
However,
replied
the individuals
that
at the
accepting
core
it
of the
was still a
tempest within the
choice.
palace still had to
Catherine's
determine
expression
if their
changed.
family's continued
Refusing a direct
brokenness
duty
was
from
necessary
Charles
for the
would
crown
also
to
be a
survive.
choice, she
Camilla's
said.
power was
Allowed
not
the Queen
restored.
Consort
Catherine's
to
elevation
influence
was
the
not
palace
revoked, and
long
the suffering
after the
caused
king
by
was
Anne's
gone.
choice was not
Charles
alleviated
asked her
by
to
the
sit
last meeting.
down.
It accomplished
She
something
continued
more
reading.
challenging.
He asked
Everyone was
again,
compelled to face
slower
reality
this time,
without any
but she
ceremonial
refused.
shield. Camilla's
The
time at
monarch
the top of
removed
the
his
royal
spectacles,
hierarchy was finished.
placed them beside
Formally,
the agenda,
Catherine had started
and looked
preparing for
directly
the
at the
future,
woman
and
he
had
had
shown that
defended for
allegiance to the
years.
monarchy sometimes
Then he
required
spoke the
taking action
sentence that
against
ended
those closest
any
to it,
illusion of
and Charles
unity.
could no longer
She
avoid
had
making
mistaken
difficult
proximity
decisions.
to the crown
Inside the
for
same
ownership
private
of
library
it.
where
That
the altercation
ceremony
had
became
started,
the moment
Charles
never
convened
forgot,
four royals.
and the warning
72-hour
Camilla
review time
underestimated.
had passed.
Windsor
The signed
Commonwealth
continuity
banquet was a
order still
formal
on the
royal
desk.
dinner
The king had
held
3
to
days
honor
halt the
representatives
transfer
from
during that
Commonwealth
review period.
nations.
The
Now her
ruling
name
was
had been
final,
moved
and
several
Catherine's new
positions
power
back
could not be
without
overturned
warning.
by a private appeal.
Catherine
Charles
Ren's
was
future
the first to
status,
speak.
she
He affirmed
insisted,
that Camilla will
did not
maintain
allow her to
status as his
overshadow
wife,
the monarch's
her personal
wife,
dignity,
while
and her
Charles
charity
still wore the
patronages.
crown.
Official
The future
royal link
king
to an
answered with
institution is
controlled
known as a
anger,
charitable patronage,
warning that
and it is
dignity
often
could
used
not
to
be
raise
protected
awareness
by
of and
humiliating
support for the
someone
group's
else.
activities.
A
However,
recorded
the monarch also
conversation
made one thing
preserved
very
by a
clear.
senior
There would be no
equerry
weakening,
later
reversal,
revealed the most
or interim
important
treatment
line of that
Catherine's
exchange.
transferred
An
responsibilities.
equerry was a
Camilla
trusted
turned to
royal
face
aide
Catherine
who
and
handled
acknowledged that the
personal
choice had
duties
caused her much
and
pain.
sensitive
She wouldn't act differently. The queen consort said that she had been motivated by fear to defend land that she would never be able to keep. Catherine praised her for being open and honest, but she didn't act as if one talk had made up for the hurt, embarrassment, or animosity between them. Then Charles turned to face Anne. He expressed regret for letting doubt fester until his sister was compelled to take action. The king acknowledged that no one had been shielded by silence. It had simply made it possible for competition to grow inside the family. Then he grabbed Camilla's hand. She hesitated for a long time before taking her wedding ring out of her pocket, putting it back on her finger, and agreeing to the marriage, even as she gave up the authority she had lost. In a secret recording of the encounter, Anne eventually broke her silence. She acknowledged that she had never intended to be the one to bring Camilla's era to an end. She took action since everyone else had been waiting for time to resolve a problem that was becoming increasingly hazardous.
No advisor,
there was no celebration
and no
of her
symbol
win.
of victory.
Accountability.
The two
With
women
Camilla at her
faced each
side,
other
Catherine
without
returned to
husbands,
the royal chamber.
titles,
The queen
or
consort
palace
paused at the
officials
threshold.
to control
She
the
turned away without
conversation.
complaint, letting the
Camilla
younger lady
expected
proceed on her own.
justification.
It wasn't just
Catherine
another
offered
public
none.
setback. With all the dignity
Instead,
she had left,
spoke
she made
about
a conscious
fear,
surrender.
duty,
One lady had been
and the
dismissed,
loneliness
and
of
another
being
had been
prepared
promoted
for a
by Anne's
crown.
single action.
Through circumstances
Camilla
no
maintained
one
her
could
dignity
fully
despite
control.
losing institutional
In
control.
that unguarded
Charles opted for
exchange,
accountability
the
rather than
conflict
evasion.
finally not
Catherine
loudly,
did not abuse her
not
position
publicly,
of authority.
but
The choice that
decisively.
none of them wanted to
Camilla
make came
learned the
at Anne's
truth
expense.
only
The
after
meeting
her
was
appeal
complete
had
when the
failed.
doors of the throne chamber
Charles had
closed
signed
behind
the order
Catherine.
before she
Camilla's
entered the
time was
room
over.
and
The
allowed her
subsequent
to
reign had
plead
taken
for a
the lead,
decision
and since its
already
future was
beyond
at last
reach.
permitted to start,
Her anger
the
did
monarchy
not turn
endured.
toward
I
William
appreciate
first.
you watching.
It turned
Please
toward
remember
the
to
man she
subscribe and
believed
like,
would
and we'll
always
see you in the
protect her.
next.